Well, 2016 England. Looks like they're back. Welcome to the World Cup Mood Board with 99.94. I'm Jarrod Kimber. Play the tape. Beautiful. Sorry, just realized I hadn't sent the tweet. Thank you everyone for joining me. That was a hammering, an absolute hammering. That was the England that I think we had been waiting to see for a long time in T20 cricket. I went back through their numbers today. You look at their one-day numbers and you're like, so much of their respect as a white ball team really comes from smashing people in the mouth in white ball cricket. They've been pretty ordinary in T20 cricket for a long time. There's reasons for that. We will discuss it, of course. But India were barely in this match. England played the dimensions of the pitch. They forced India to go slow, or at least very much encouraged it. And they attacked with the first legal delivery of the bat all the way through to the end. And it was very much an old school England team. A bowling unit held together by Adil Rashid and multiple options around him, I suppose is the nicest way of putting it. And a batting lineup with Adil Rashid and his 10 first-class hundreds were coming into bat at number 11. I think my favourite England sides over the last few years have just been when Adil Rashid and his 10 first-class hundreds have been batting at number 11. If for nothing else, it really annoys Darren Gough, who was the man who once pushed Adil Rashid up the order to make a lot of those hundreds back in the day. But it says a lot that they didn't need to worry about the depth of their batting. Although I will say, you do hear a lot of people say things like, oh, number 7 doesn't bat that much. And, so you don't need a strong number 7. You don't, unless you want your top 6 to really go hard. And when you can bat all the way down to what Wokes at 9, Chris Jordan would have been handy at 10, and then Adil Rashid at 11, it allows your top order to go so much stronger. And it's a huge advantage. It's the dream, really, when you're setting up a team like this. I must admit there were times when I thought that the pitch might have been a bit too paced when India was batting on it. Hardik, when he was getting edges against, was it Liam Livingstone? I think, it looked like the ball just wasn't coming on right. And of course, Rohit Sharma seemed to be using the toe of his bat for a long period there. England made the wicket look pretty good though, didn't it? In comparison. Look, if you look at this, you will see that was the 4th quickest knock that England have had this year. And if you look at the overall strike rates here, this is not an all-inspiring team that has been smashing everyone. But what we saw today is what everyone kind of expected more of for England to reach this World Cup. And it hasn't been that kind of World Cup. This was probably one of the better batting pitches, I suppose, we've seen in some ways, in that the ball did come on fairly well. And you could certainly still score at the end. And there wasn't really a lot of seam or swing early on that caused major problems from that perspective. So, and if you do look at England, throughout the entirety of the year, and over the last couple of years, really, a lot of injuries. They've had the Milan catch-up knocks, which has probably got them slightly different to the way that they would probably traditionally prefer to score. And then you've got Morgan's form, which was a key thing. Bunches of injuries, and then just all the resting and the COVID and all the different lineups that they've had. It's really hard to get a really good look at them. And so we haven't seen England look like England for a very long time. But the fact that their strike rate's so high right there does give you a good idea that we have seen that England right at the moment. And if you go back, this is what they've done since the start of 2016. Since the end of the World Cup in 2016. In that tournament, they're up with the West Indies as scoring very, very fast and changing the way that it was played. Since that time, India has actually scored slightly quicker than England in T20 internationals. And New Zealand are pretty much on the same level. And I looked at these numbers for like the last 2 years, the last 3 years. No matter where you look at them, England hasn't been doing what they did today consistently for a long time. And in this World Cup, of course, the batting order hadn't exploded the way that they wanted it to because wet wickets, early season wickets, bowlers doing well, the Kookaburra seam, all these different little things have meant that it hasn't quite been that. Today was probably the closest we've seen England back to that original plan that Bayliss, Morgan, Nathan Lehman, and those sorts of guys came up with all those years ago. You know, bat hard, bat deep, essentially, and try and make at least a minimum of 20 runs more than what any other team would be able to do in that situation. That helps your bowlers put extra pressure on the opposition. Which means that quite often the England bowlers are very good at taking wickets because the other team's trying to score slightly quicker than they can. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the team batting first. This is what we thought if the best England showed up would happen. I don't think we've actually seen the best England in this tournament so far, but today was far closer to that. And what we saw was when they do bat to their full potential, or in this case, only two of them, but when they do bat to their full potential, they're just batting on another level than every other team. Doesn't mean that their bowling isn't a liability. It doesn't mean they'll be able to do it on all surfaces in all games. But on a pitch like that was a fairly standard T20 pitch, they are completely stacked. And they should be able to bat any team out of the World Cup. And today, that team was India. All right, let's go on to... Thank you, Mooker. Let's go on to... Adil Rashid and Alex Hales here. So, Alex Hales is an incredible story because, you know, for those who don't know the full part of it, essentially he had a falling out with the England team, the England management, the ECB in general. Like he had so many falling outs with so many people in English cricket that it looked like he might never play again. And if you looked at his numbers a couple of years ago, you would have seen that at the time he was. They weren't as good as they are now. So the one thing I would say about Hales is he was more of a limited hitter. Maybe the first time he played in the IPL, for instance, when he played for the Sunrisers, he was a bit limited at that time. And the majority, he had this great strike rate. I think he had a strike rate of something like 165 or 170. But when you looked at his strike rate back then, it was like 200 strike rate at Trent Bridge and 140 everywhere else. 140 is still really good. But there was a bump on his mark that came from Trent Bridge. And I think over the last couple of years, he has really worked on his game. And the one thing that you notice today is that there's no real field restriction that can have for him. So he can hit on both sides of the wicket. And I would say that while he could always hit over cover, he wasn't particularly a strong square of the wicket player on the offside. He's really got a lot better at that. But he's always been able to hit to the leg side. If you can only hit in those two directions, teams can still set a field to you. What they will do is they'll bring mid-off up into the circle and they'll bowl a little bit shorter. The problem with that for Hales is because he's so strong but also so tall, if you get your length slightly wrong, he can easily clear mid-off at any stage. And that's his actual strength, I would say, as a batter. He's probably hitting dead straight. So there is no real great way of bowling to him in that sort of way. And he has completely changed. And to be honest, Jason Roy's form is the reason that Alex Hales is here. If Jason Roy's form had held up at all, he wouldn't have got his second, or is this his third chance? I'm not sure what chance we're up to. So far in this tournament, Hales has 211 runs. This 86 followed up the 52 he made against New Zealand and a 47 against Sri Lanka. So again, good runs against some of the better bowling units that he's gone up against, and varied bowling units as well. If you look at the different options he's had to go up against, that's going up against some high pace at times, some really good swing bowling, some really good finger spin, some really good wrist spin, some really good mystery spin. Do you know what I mean? It's really interesting how much more rounded he is. A couple of years ago, and I've been following him since he made his debut. Used to watch a lot of Notts cricket. And he's just so much more of a rounded player than he was for a long time, even when he had the big reputation. But if you come to this, we've got him as number 3 in the leading run scorers in the Super 12 stage and onwards. Sorry to all the Dutch and Sri Lankan cricketers who probably should be on this list. I'm trying to think if there's anyone else. But for someone who's only here because Roy wasn't making any runs, I think this is something quite special for Alex Hales. Maybe it might annoy Owen Morgan, but that's for another time. And the other thing is, of course, that these two strike so well. So when you put him together with Jos Buttler, the partnership there is really good. And we talked about a little bit in the preview that Adelaide might be an advantage for Hales because he's played there so much. He's made 435 runs in Adelaide. I think it's the ground he's played at the third or fourth most in his career. Obviously played for the Strikers. It's the second most. Second most runs he's made outside of his home of Trent Bridge. So he really does well there. He averages 48 at Adelaide with a strike rate of 157. Today he made 86 at a strike rate of 183 with 7 sixes and 4 fours. And India didn't really look like they knew what to do. I felt there was more planning for Buttler than there was for Hales, and that could have just been that everyone knows Buttler so well. There was more, but you had the keeper coming up the stumps and moving back and everything else there. So it's quite interesting. The other player that's worth talking about here, and he won't get as much because of what Buttler and Hales did, he won't get as much airtime. But Adil Rashid was absolutely brilliant here. And again, a bit like Alex Hales, he's another player who we talked about in the preview of having good memories of Adelaide. He played for the Strikers. And also played a good game against Sri Lanka there. He went at just over 5 runs and over, but I think probably the most crucially, he took the wicket of Sky. Came on in the power play as well, which was, I think, quite an interesting one. He now has 18 wickets at Adelaide, and he's taken those wickets at an average of, I think it's 13 or 14, and doesn't go much more at a run and ball there as well. And for those who haven't been following Rashid much this tournament, he's only taken 2 wickets so far. He's really struggled to break through, and there was a couple of drop catches in that, I should add as well. But I think there's certainly, and I think someone might have sent a message on here recently about the fact that he didn't look as good as he had before. It was age getting on. So with wrist spinners, kind of what happens is you lose the ability to put the actual amount of revs that you want to be able to put on the ball. And if you look at Adil Rashid at times in this tournament, he has been sliding the ball out the front. Now, we have seen other players like Shane Warne had the second half of his career. There was a combination of getting revs on the ball and sliding the ball. So it's not a complete career killer. But I remember watching Brad Hogg when he stopped putting the revs on the ball. What it meant was people could sweep him a lot more because he didn't get the extra bounce. And it's fair to say that Adil Rashid is already a little bit maybe slower than those other two as well. Well, he's probably about the same pace as Warren, but a little bit, not as strong as the other two guys as terms of athletes go. So it's a really interesting one. However, he just bowled really well today. He knows this surface really well. It's quite clearly a good pitch for wrist spin, as Rashid Khan will tell you, and I'll talk about again later. But I do think that having 2 players who are nearly experts in Adelaide Oval and then having them both have very good games, these things matter. And, so many of the England players have played so much cricket in the Big Bash now. It's a really interesting development that, there's all the talk about playing in the IPL, which is really helpful. But there's a few other leagues in the world where you can learn some things as well. And in this particular case, they had a World Cup semi-final where they know the ground really well. Sometimes that helps. All right, let's get on to Jos Buttler. So what if I told you that Jos Buttler was an anchor and we should really think about him that way, and we don't? And it probably slightly depends on how you define that role. There are some ways where I could tell you mathematically he's definitely an anchor. And there are certainly, that's a snazzy picture. And there are other ways where I could definitely show you that he's not an anchor. But what I mean by that is that if the main role of the anchor is to bat longer than everyone else and have everyone bat around you, that's essentially what he does from the top of that. And he scores well above the average of what a standard opener would score at. And I suppose that's what I'm talking about. I'd probably call him a long form opener, and yet he does it with a strike rate that you would normally associate with people on a short form type of average. So he has the ability to score for a very long time. And if you look at his record, he scores more runs than most anchors do per innings. And he also obviously scores far quicker than most anchors. So if he is the anchor, and there's probably other players up there in that sort of mindset as well. David Warner might be another one who you could put up there as well. But what he does is he scores very evenly, and he doesn't get behind like a lot of anchors do. So there's no catch up. He's generally scoring at a fairly decent rate. But he then has the ability to score at a ridiculous rate when he wants to. So if you look at what he's done in the last, this is since the start of 2017. So this is the major run scorer since the start of 2017. You'll see that there's a couple of outliers here. So the one with the darkest color is Andre Russell, and he's obviously just a tad scoring quicker than everyone else in T20 cricket. At the top, you'll see Devon Conway, who's averaging over 55 in T20 cricket in that time. This is what, and then you've got AB de Villiers, who is averaging, a really healthy number there, and also striking. You can see that Jos Buttler is not as far away from the pack. He's in the good angle, right? That combination between average and strike rate is the good sort of part of that to be in. But there's a lot of players like Hales and a Sky, and there's someone else at the front of that strike rate area who obviously score a lot quicker than him. But it is his ability. Oh, that came from nowhere. It's his ability really to score at a very decent rate, but also still score 10 runs more per innings than what a standard player would. So it does show you that he sort of has a few different gears available to him and different skills that he can use, and I think that. My biggest concern when he was starting to open was that when he did open, were they potentially setting themselves up for him failing a little bit more? And you can have a look at his average. That's not the problem. And he is someone who nicks off a little bit, which is why I did find it slightly interesting that India tried the wicketkeeper up at the stumps, because traditionally a wicketkeeper at the stumps is less likely to catch the edge. I think that it hasn't affected him, though. Going up the order hasn't affected him at all from that perspective, and he's managed to still score a lot of runs and quite quickly. And the other thing that is quite interesting with Buttler is the ability to... he can be the main aggressor, but also be the guy who supports the other player, partly because he's a good runner between wickets, although I did like the man-cad, him being deep in the crease against... Ashwin today, but he can be the main aggressor, or he can play that support role, and he plays it very well. And part of the reason he can do that is because he's known for having a very relatively low ego. So he's not one of those people that tries to once he's in a rush, he's happy to get off. Sorry, if the other person's in a rush, he's happy to get off strike and not try and catch fire himself. And Nasser Hussain also talks about the fact that Buttler doesn't even seem to know how good he is. And he's talked about that a lot. He's a really interesting player, but it was a fantastic innings today. And I've given you all the numbers. Shall we just, have a look at it for a moment?
For Jos Buttler. Very clean. Oh, that's a long boundary, and he's cleared it. Oh, what a shot that is.
Might seem a bit rude to say so, but at the moment, it looks like a contest between two boxers from different weight.
Oh, what
sensational.
That's high. It's over, Kohli. They win by 10 wickets. It's a record partnership.
Yeah, it's pretty good, wasn't it? There's some hitting at that. It's funny, I felt that it's a very good partnership between the two of them, because I think Buttler wouldn't mind to knock the ball around a little bit for 10 balls or so. Sometimes he can obviously start quicker than that, but I do like the idea that Hales kind of usually just goes, I'm going to hit a couple of big ones. So Hales starts more in that sort of Luke Ronchi style of if I can get a couple away early, it will all roll for me. And Butler's a little bit different. It's a good combination, those two players, all things considered. I want to move on to England's injuries, because it's really, really interesting going through their team over the last couple of World Cups. And look, in any World Cup, you're going to have injury concerns and everything else. But there's absolutely no doubt that England has been incredibly affected by injuries over the last two campaigns. So today they missed Dawid Malan and Mark Wood. If you look at what their best choice team should have been today, they're also missing Jofra Archer, Reece Topley, I'm missing someone else, and Johnny Besto, right? So that's their absolute probably best choice team. That's a lot of players to not have in a World Cup semi-final. And if you go back to 2021, Ben Stokes was taking a health, for a mental health injury. They named Sam Curran in their squad with a back injury, and then had to rule him out. Tamal Mills and Jason Roy both went down with different leg muscles throughout that tournament. This time around, obviously, Bairstow destroyed his leg weeks before on the golf course. We should definitely ban golf. Reece Topley tripped on the boundary toe blown before a warm-up and twisted his ankle, which is absolutely... I laughed then just because it's... As someone who's worked in cricket grounds, you've no idea how high those Toblerones are. They are really dangerous. And the fact that poor Reece Topley, who's had the worst injury record of all time, has managed to trip on one is just ridiculous. Obviously then you had Milan and Wood in this one. It's worth noting as well that England's win-loss ratio in the cycle of those two World Cups, so from 2016 edition onwards, sits at 1.4, which is below India and Pakistan. And so we've seen a lot of injuries, but what that also means is, and one of the reasons England have the lower win-loss ratio is because they have tried so many different players. So when a player comes in, I think the only player who's probably playing against role definition in this side at the moment is Sam Curran. Don't think he was ever supposed to be a first-choice death bowler. Jofra would have taken some of those overs. Reece Topley might have taken some of those overs as well. Reece Topley might have been in the side ahead of Sam Curran, even, at times if they only wanted the one left-arm bowler in this tournament. But what England have been doing over that time is really using the bilaterals in the way that Australia probably used to use them back in the day, which is getting the players into good positions so they know that they're jobs, but also making sure that the backups also can come in and do that. And you can see that some of the other teams probably have been slightly less about that at times. And so for England, it's really come up trumps in the fact that they've had so many injuries over two World Cups, but they still have players who probably feel fairly comfortable. I would say, Chris Woakes is probably one of the few, especially in the last World Cup, where you're just like, you had to feel sorry for him because he wasn't supposed to be there. But as a general rule, like most of these players have, a fairly tried and tested around it. And it's really, it's incredible. But it's also... it's allowed the injuries today, if you look at them, actually allowed for them, I think, to play a slightly better lineup. And I don't think they'll go back with it. I think they prefer, especially now they have Jofra and Wood, when they're available anyway. I think they might prefer to pick them, even if they don't give them a lot of batting. But I think that, England's ability to bat so deep and so hard is what makes them a better T20 side, game in, game out. And so... that because of the way that the injuries have fallen this time, it has allowed for that. Also, they've used Ben Stokes bowling far more, like I suppose most people had been saying for a while coming in, whereas they hadn't played him that much and they hadn't used him in that sort of role before. All right, let's take a quick break and then we will get on to a little bit on that other team that played today.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right. Let us get to India, shall we? So I'll get to this later, but there's not a lot to analyze at a certain point. In fact, this game doesn't have a lot of analysis in it because it's not particularly... it wasn't particularly close. And if this was like a mid-season IPL game or, a blast game, you forget about it quickly, you just move on to the next game. But it's World Cup semi-final. So I do have some stuff. From overs 8 to 13, India scored at 5.6 runs and over. And they were 1 wicket down coming into this period. They did lose 2 more in that period, to be fair. So I suppose that kind of makes sense. But that's a long period to be scoring at less than a run a ball. And of course, I have put up England's total next to them, which is a bit unfair. But remember, England had 10 wickets in hand and India had 9 wickets in hand coming into that 8th over. I think that's right. Yeah, because Rohit was still batting then. And there was a lot of different things when you look at England's innings. Obviously, the players were in better form. They were seeing the ball better. They decided to attack a lot harder. They had a lot more batting behind them. All those sorts of things. Didn't have a bunch of wrist spinners to go up against either. But that is a very stark thing. But I'm going to show you something else a little bit more specific. And I'm trying to explain this the best I can. This is a little bit messier than I usually try and put stuff up. But there are 3 lines here. You can see the blue line is India in 2022. You can see the green line is this World Cup before today. And you can see the orange line is today. So we can see that this year they have certainly been a lot more aggressive in the first part of their games. And they've been batting quite, attacking the power play, managed to keeping that at a fairly good level all the way through the middle overs as well, and then kicking on at the death. You can see that at this World Cup, they're not quite doing the same thing. So at this World Cup, and part of this was conditions and slightly better bowling attacks. It's easy in T20 cricket to hit the backups and some of the lesser teams. But when you get to the major stuff and there's a World Cup online, most teams slow down a little bit. But you can see that India didn't slow down a little bit. They slowed down a lot in the power play. The interesting thing is that almost the minute the power play ends, they were kicking back into gear quite well throughout those middle overs. And then you can see they were doing fine all the way through. So the real lost runs from an efficiency standpoint are really in that first 6, weirdly enough 7 in their case, overs, right? If you look at today, after the first 3 overs, they certainly had a huge problem there. Then they kicked quite well at the back end of that power play. But then you can see what happens. They had 1 good over in the 11th, but almost everything else is really, really poor there. There's a few things to remember here. One is that they had 6 overs at 5 runs or fewer in the first 13 overs of the game. You can try and catch up all you want at that point, but that's putting you so massively behind in any game of T20 cricket. This is also the period when Adil Rashid bowled, and he was a big, big part of that. I think he bowled 3 of the 6 overs that I'm talking about. We obviously didn't know what the pitch would do beforehand. This was a thrice used pitch, and yet if you compare it to the SCG that had only been used once, this had better pace and better carry. It obviously got spin, but we'll talk specifically about the spin in a moment. But the balls didn't hold up, and the best way you can tell that it's a true pitch is that if you're bowling slower balls, they shouldn't really be at a massive advantage over on-pace balls. And so you should be able to still get wickets off slower balls and everything else, but you should be able to do it off the on-pace balls. And today, there wasn't a huge difference. When people did bowl slower balls, not that much happened. The best example of that might be the knuckleball that Boovi bowled to Alex Hales, which he belted over extra cover. So this was a much better pitch. It didn't do what the SCG one did. Specifically, have a look at the orange line here with Hardik at the death. You can certainly see that the ball. We didn't lose the steam out of the ball, the air out of the ball like we did in that last game. But one thing that I don't think anyone could really work out is the whole, when you have a look at the fact that the wrist spinners did so much better. So I had a look at this pitch and the data on it. And the problem is there's no good way of looking at the data on the Adelaide Oval pitch when it comes to wrist spin versus finger spin. And the reason for that is that the bowler who's bowled the most spin there is Rashid Khan. And obviously he's pretty good everywhere. So in Adelaide, he has 29 wickets at 16 in the last 3 years there. I just told you that Adil Rashid is another one. But there haven't been a lot of top quality finger spinners even bowl there. There aren't that many that go through the Big Bash. And when they have played a couple of international games or whatever, they've only played one-offs. And there were some finger spinners who did well on the 1 or 2 games that they had. But wrist spin has been bowled there so much more than finger spin. But there's no doubt, looking at that game today and looking at this orange dip specifically, 4 of which of the overs were wrist spin, because Liam Livingstone bowled one of them as well. There's just no doubting that wrist spin played a much bigger part than finger spin. Now, it's easy to say that Chahal should have played, and some people thought he should have played beforehand as well. I don't think I would have ever said to myself that this is a realistic difference. You might say that wrist spin works slightly better at Adelaide Oval than finger spin, but not to the degree that we saw today. You shouldn't really have a situation where Liam Livingstone looks a lot more deadly than Ashwin. Some of that is game situation. By the time Livingstone came on, I can't remember if it must have been for the second over he bowled, or the 13th over anyway. By that stage, a lot of pressure had been built up by England already, and it's always a little bit easier to bowl in that situation, and wickets had already come. But it did feel that was a pitch that just helped wrist spin a lot more than finger spin, and one team had a lot of it and the other one didn't. Just on that orange line at the end, obviously Hardik Pandya played a catch-up innings today, but when he caught up, it was magnificent, and India had 3 catch-up innings today. Rohit Sharma was trying to do it, didn't get a chance to catch up. Virat Kohli was starting to catch up when he was dismissed, but for a long period, I think, 31 off 27 off 28 at one stage? That may not even be the worst his strike rate got to, but he went at around a run of ball for a long period. In fact, he was a run of ball in that middle section as well. So between the 8th over and the 13th over, the only player that India had who was above run of ball was Sky, who was dismissed. The fact that they had 3 catch-up innings and only one player could do it was the problem. But it is worth saying that as far as catch-up innings go, Hardik Pandya played a pretty spectacular one. Shall we roll the tape?
I said that very, very hard. It didn't matter how far wide long on was. Nobody was going to stop it.
Short hit seriously hard. Goes all the way for 6. Short, belted away, and again a flick. That is even better.
With and the other India, short.
That's gone leg side. That's gone big. Flicked away. Stokes does well. Stokes doesn't do well.
It is. Like we said earlier, it took his time to get going.
Pandya. That's been hit long on. Can long on take the catch, or is he getting into the crowd? That's been hit leg side. Can Stokes get there? Please. I think he's trod on his stumps there.
All right. Okay, so we'll move on to India's day. When it's not your day, it's not ideal. And when you lose by 10 wickets, it's probably fair to say it's not your day. It's hard to really state how bad things went for India at various times. There were so many moments that I suppose the ICC could turn into those Kriktos NFTs to honor the occasion. You could buy like a collection of India's worst moments. I'm not sure how much that would be worth into the future, but it was certainly not particularly ideal. If you start with the strike rate in this game, so something that I haven't been doing much recently, but something I want to do more and more is strike rates versus run a ball to give you a really good idea of how people are going. Rohit Sharma's innings was just incredibly frustrating to watch. I reckon he probably hit more balls off the toe of his bat than he did off the middle. It was, he was scoring a run every 2 balls at times in the power play. Hit the back-to-back boundaries at one stage to try and bring him back. But when you look at his run rate in this game compared to all the other batters, KL Rahul failed. Virat Kohli is, not particularly good. Yadav wasn't in that long. Rishabh at the death. But then the other 3 guys, they're just, considering Rohit got the best of the new ball, got the field up, it really was one of those innings that just was absolutely torturous. And when he finally went out, felt like a relief that he hadn't really that he hadn't stayed any longer. Could have been a real like Lendl Simmons type innings where he almost couldn't get out. And the other really weird thing, obviously Virat's strike rate was a problem for a long period as well. But then they smash the ball everywhere, India, and then there's always a bad sign when you stand on your stumps for the last ball of the innings. That would have been a 4 as well, I think, wouldn't it? I think that one went off for 4. I was a bit more focused on the stumps at that point. But it does feel like, there's a, what happens on the last ball doesn't always, predict what's going to happen in the rest of the innings. But there's a moment where you can't help but think to yourself, you don't want to stand on your stumps for the last ball. You'd rather mishit it and scamper through for a 2, or maybe scamper through for 1 and get run out going for the second, than you would actively stand on your stumps. So I don't know how many times I've ever seen that at that stage, because it wasn't one of those ones where he went. That was like a test match, stand on your stumps. That wasn't like a T20. I've got too close to my stumps to give myself more room. It was the old-fashioned foot back as you try and run. Anyway. Remarkable a moment. And then there was in the field. We've actually got a couple of clips. I think Muku will play them now. There was it just looked all game like there was just something so wrong. So this is a scoop from Buttler that he closts this one a little bit. It's going down. They're going to run 2. And then Mohammad Shami does this. I'm a really bad underarm thrower to another human being, so I know what this is like. But what an error, a weird error to make. I don't know. I've seen people do poor throws to other people, but it looked like he'd never thrown underarm before. And Rohit was, of course, very angry and asking him to throw the ball normally for a big period. But just, by this stage in the game, England were already on top. But that is just, and the little skip at the end just doesn't help anything there, does it? But that was just such a schoolboy error to see from, an experienced player. And no one's saying he's the world's best fielder or anything, but to see from someone at that stage, and also the way it just falls into, poor Hardik, the way it just falls into the gap. And of course, Mohammad Shami is bowling later on. And this is just, again, the game is completely over by this stage. There's no way India is coming back. But how many times in your life have you seen someone drop a ball about 5 meters outside the ring on a long straight hit boundary, and for the ball to still go for 4? Like, that's an extra, that's a wicket and probably an extra, 6, 7 runs? When it's not your day, it's not your day. It was absolutely remarkable. And, I've said this, I sort of alluded to this at the top. If I'm doing analysis on for a team, or even, for you guys on YouTube, I would have said that this is what I would call a throwaway game, where you look at this and you go, okay, everything went wrong for India here. We don't need to worry about this game. Just throw it away and get to the next game. And I've done that as an analyst before. I've had coaches ask for notes, and I'll just be like, no, you don't want notes from this game. You literally, this game, everything went wrong. We had a few players who were out of form. All at the same time, and we lost the game. Let's go on to the next one. The problem is that it is a World Cup semi-final, and it comes on the back of the fact that, India have not made the final of the last 2 tournaments. And, you look at, there was, I'm trying to think, you've got 2 decent Indian teams who've come in with 2 different methods, with 2 different ways of thinking about T20 cricket, with different form and everything else. But the one constant is that they haven't managed to actually go on and make a final. And look, that happens in knockout games and everything else. But at a certain point, you do have to wonder what needs to be done next. And I'm not sure they were, I'm not sure if they'd not played a semi-final against one of the other 2 teams. Not to say that, Pakistan and New Zealand were worse than them. Perhaps this was a slightly bad matchup. I think the wicket definitely favoured England, which these things are going to happen sometimes. But I also feel that at times they didn't quite go back to that new method of attacking the way they should have. If there was any place that they were going to do it, we talk about problem solving in these World Cups, right? The rest of the tournament, the way that India knocked the ball around at the start, I didn't mind that too much. Here, in this particular game, it didn't make as much sense, and perhaps it was just because Rohit couldn't hit the ball, which is also very possible. But you can throw out excuses and say that India didn't have their full strength team, but England had far less of their full strength team. And it felt in this particular game like India was stuck between the two methods. The idea of smacking the ball around everywhere and that old school India style of, taking it slow. And of all the teams that can come unstuck against, it's England, because you do have to push yourself a little bit more on a surface that suits England. And this one certainly did. So it was not great for India. Let's move on to the final. I thought England and Pakistan were the best two teams in the previous World Cup. And so part of me thinks that it's nice that they've made this final. Anything can happen in knockout games. Finn Allen could have gone on a roll against Shaheen Afridi, and England could have lost a bunch of wickets against Bhuvi when the ball was swinging around. So even in knockout games, when they both won quite comfortably in T20, we know how quickly those things can certainly swing around. And in the last 3 World Cup finals, now, it is worth noting that we've only had one Asian team make it out of the 6 finalists. So the ICC apparently are doing a terrible job of the nonsense conspiracy about having India and Pakistan in all the finals. Sorry, couldn't help but put that in. I wonder what it would have taken to beat England today, but I think there has been... I do think that these teams, when you look at the entire tournament, probably deserved a final after what they did last time. And if you look at it as what I'm looking at it as now, which is 11, 12 game season, it's a really interesting matchup. The strength of England is in their batting power and depth, and the strength of Pakistan is their ability to take wickets all the way through the game and probably have strong top order players. I've always thought that the best way to beat England was just to load up on wicket takers. But I suppose conversely, the best way to play against Pakistan is to have a lot of people bat all the way down the order and have Adil Rashid batting at number 11. The biggest variable in this is obviously going to be the pitch. It hasn't rained that much in Melbourne over the last week or so. So the curator will have that as an advantage, which they did not have before some of the other World Cup games. However, it is supposed to rain Friday and Saturday and Sunday. So even if the pitch is fairly close to being ready, they're not going to be able to quite get it to the state that they would want. And it is supposed to rain all day Sunday and at this stage all day on the reserve day as well. So if we add up all this information and we collect the fact of what we've seen so far in the World Cup, the early season pitches, the rain around in the next few days, and perhaps the fact that if they do try and play, there might be some rain around when the covers are off. I think we can expect probably a similar kind of surface to the England-Ireland match, which Ireland won. But it might also be a wicket that's not that far off what we saw for the India-Pakistan match, which India won. So England clearly are going to have more experience on that kind of pitch than Pakistan will. But Pakistan has 3 proper first-class batters in their top 4, and by far the better seam bowling attack. So you would think that they should have the edge on that surface, which is pretty funny considering it is essentially English conditions. But we'll have more for those games, or that game, over the next couple of days. So me and Charlie will bring some things up to have a look at what's happened so far in the tournament. But I'll have a quick break here, and then after the break, we will get to your questions.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
Let me just see some of the questions. All right, let's see what we've got. Sultan says, oh, wait, got to click on it, Sultan. Sultan says, some days England's batting seems indestructible. How should India have bowled to them today? Probably should have played in the other semi-final. I'm not sure what you do to Buttler. He's a really tricky one if you don't get wickets against him early on. They were trying the in-swing, out-swing thing to him. I think if it was me, I probably would have stuck with out-swing against him. I think I would have, and the ball didn't swing as much as India probably wanted. When you've got a seam bowling attack like that, you probably want the ball to swing around a little bit more. I think I would have persisted with outswingers and the slips. I wouldn't have worried about having the keeper up the stumps. If Buttler wants to change the length, he's allowed to. I might have, and this may not have worked, and I'm not sure how much Arshdeep has tried this before, but I might have asked Arshdeep to bowl around the wickets and try and straighten the ball away from him. Obviously, having a wrist spinner would have helped as well. At the very least, it would have given, and I'm not saying it was a mistake not picking him, because I wasn't sitting there saying Chahal would absolutely have to play. I'm a big fan of Chahal, so it wouldn't have bothered me if he had. But I understand the reasons why India didn't do that. They probably wanted more strength in their batting, and also they had the ability to spin the ball in both ways, but the finger spinners just didn't look as useful on this particular wicket. So I think those are a few different options, and I had one more. I just felt like to Hales, they hadn't really thought everything through. The only other thing I might have said is, if the slow balls weren't working to Hales, it would have been worth going for 2 overs of back-to-back bounces against him. It's hard at Adelaide, though, because you've got the short square boundaries and people don't like it. But the thing I would say about Adelaide is, when you generally get your wickets with short balls in general, when you generally get your wickets, it's from a top edge. And if that top edge flies fine, there's actually quite often a fielder there in Adelaide, because that's where the boundary is a little bit longer. But the reason that teams don't do it, of course, is because you only need to miss hit a couple over square. So maybe they wouldn't have done that. But yeah, so I suppose that's a few different options. But if you're a swing bowling team and the ball hasn't quite swung the way you wanted it to, probably didn't get as much seam movement as they would have liked as well. And then you don't have a wrist spinner. There's probably just a few things that were against them. That's why Sultan, I would sort of say that this is a little bit of a throwaway game. And sometimes you can just go up against your opposition and they're in form and the conditions help them. If India had made an extra 25 runs, maybe that would have been different. They would have been able to build pressure in a different way on them. But, having that kind of score, it didn't feel like enough unless there was some magical thing that made you score really slowly in the middle overs, which apparently, well, maybe there was, and that was wrist spin. Q says, do you think Kohli will win player of the tournament? 296 runs and 98 average are ungodly numbers. Sikandar Raza would be interesting, won't it? It'd be really interesting to see. They still overrate the amount of runs that you make. I'd have to have a look at everything else. I'm trying to think if there's any bowler that has scary numbers. Can't think of anyone. You've got, obviously, Van Meekeren's got really good numbers, but he doesn't have numbers that are scary, so they probably won't give it to a bowler. Sikandar Raza is a really interesting one on that. I wouldn't think they would give it to him. If you look traditionally, my memory is that quite often it's weighted towards the team who wins the tournament as well. Mitchell Starc won it in 2015 and didn't win it in 2019. And I thought he was a much more impactful player in 2019 than he was in 2015. But the difference was that Australia didn't win that tournament. So I do think that there are certainly that does play a part. But as you probably know, Q, I don't really care about player of the match or player of the... if it was done properly, I would care. But it's just nonsense most of the time. Keshav said, should India look at splitting the coaching captaincy in T20 after another failed campaign and walk the talk when it comes to T20 approach and personnel? Well, they played... it's a weird one, the whole walk the talk the walk situation, because I've been saying since the start of this tournament that Australia, England, and India, I think, all went with a more aggressive approach and decided that they were going to score really quickly. Then they got dropped in this tournament and realized it wasn't quite that tournament. Now, this is why I talk about problem solving and the ability to gear up and gear down, because that's what happens in a World Cup. You're not going to get 5 pitches that are going to suit your strengths. And so you have to be a little bit smarter with the way that you play. And, I think that today was probably a very good day where India should have gone harder in the power play. Having said all that, there's no way that Rohit was trying to be at a strike rate of 50 or whatever he was for a long period there before he hit the boundaries. So from that perspective, you do have to factor in form, right? And touch. And, the opposition perhaps bowling particularly well to you at different times. So I think that certainly has to play a part in it. But you saw from that, the line graph that I put up, that there's no doubt that all the way through this World Cup, they were playing slower in the power play than they had been for the rest of this year. And so if their talk was that we're going to attack the power play more, we didn't see that in this tournament. And I would have thought that of all the games, this was the game that made the most sense, being that it didn't seem like the ball was doing as much as we had seen at other venues so far. Tim says, does an all-run 4 count as a boundary in Buttler stats? I mean, it depends on how you're doing the stats. If you're doing a traditional stat, it doesn't count as a boundary, but it counts as a 4. Most people now, like me, we just look at 4s. So even if you get an overthrow, and I don't know, you've scored a single, and then you get a 3 from the overthrows, it can go into your stats. But you're talking about someone who's made 5,000 runs in the last... No, was it 3,000? 3,500 runs in the last 5 years or something, and probably 7,000 runs in his career. It's not going to warp his stats. So no one's that worried about it. But if we were scoring properly, there would be lots of different things that we would change within scoring when it comes to things like that. A neutral guy says, what is the secret behind England's white ball depth? They have so much talent, so many players get injured, yet they still manage to make it to the final. They don't have a good 18 program. They do have a pretty good 18 program. I think their Lions program is part of it. A lot of it is just that they have a lot of white ball players who are really good. So they have that sort of generation, a lot of which grew up on that Pro 40 scene. So back in those days, you would play, they had 50 over cricket, 40 over cricket, T20 cricket. A lot of white ball cricket was played. And then if you look at the amount of games that they play in the Blast compared to other teams, again, they played a lot of that as well. And I do think that they were, if you look at the numbers, certainly considering how cricket is in England, they certainly managed to do what you would call very flat pitches a lot, which meant that their bowlers have to improvise and come up with new ways of doing things, and that their batters are trained to hit through the line of the ball and really trust themselves. So I think that was a big part of it. Then, of course, with the Bayliss, Morgan, Lehman era, they came up with very good tactics, but they also identified really key roles, and then they made sure that there were backups available for them in the role. So other than Liam Plunkett, and they still hope Mark Wood will be able to do that role, though he does play a little bit differently. Other than Liam Plunkett, and obviously probably when Adil Rashid goes, they kind of have backups everywhere available to them. Like they want Ben Stokes in this side, but they also, a bit like with Joe Root, they might also get to a point where they're just like, if we can do better without him, we will. I think that sort of ruthlessness. I mean, Williamson, Smith, Kohli, Rohit, they are from a different era of T20 batting. And some of them are just also slightly past their best. They've got injuries, they've got age concerns, all those sorts of things. Joe Root was a fantastic T20 player. And England just went, not part of our plans, we're moving on. Part of that is depth, but it's also, I don't think they quite thought that Joe Root was going to play the way that they wanted him to play. It was probably slightly unfair, but that's what they did. So they have really backed that. The other thing I should mention is that they have tinkered with their team a lot. And they've tinkered with their team in a different way than we've seen Australia. Sometimes with Australia, you watch them tinker with their side, and you do get the feeling they're just trying plays to see how they would go. When England are tinkering with their side, you get a little bit more of a feeling that they're saying, okay, well, this guy's pretty good. We need to see him at a slightly higher level, but we also want him to learn this role. And I think that's been really, really key as well. So there's quite a few different parts of it play. Don't ever underestimate how much Pro 40 matters, though. I think it was a really important competition, and because in some ways Pro 40 it does two things. That it meant that you had to attack a lot more, and you had to learn at scoring at around run a ball and slightly higher without losing your wicket. which is especially in tournament play, I think really comes back. And a lot of these players had a very good early grounding in their career on that. I mean, whether that holds up in the future, but you look at Hales and Buttler, these are not guys with, we see other players with, 140, 150, 160 plus strike rates, but they're averaging 20 and 25, which is fine. You see a lot of more of the England players where they still seem to be averaging 30, 35, 40, 45 by doing the same thing. I think that's really interesting. Who we got next here? I have Jim. Oh, I can't. JML. I'll call him JML. Is there any inherent weakness in England's batting other than go hard or go home? So the traditionally the biggest weakness has been when the pitch doesn't allow them to play through the line. So that can sometimes be from sideways movement. It can sometimes be from spin. It can sometimes be from slow wickets. When they don't have the ability to basically back themselves and just play through the line over and over again, we've seen that. I think they're a slightly smarter team than that now, and I think if you have a look at the difference between 2017 Champions Trophy and 2019 World Cup, they didn't actually win the World Cup by just bashing the ball everywhere. They did adapt a little bit more to the conditions, and they have been smarter at thinking about that after probably what happened in 2017 when Pakistan beat them in the semi-final down at Cardiff. So that has been the traditional weakness. I think the other weakness is if you get them on a wicket that has sideways movement with quality bowlers going up against them. If you look at their batting lineup, Hales, Buttler, so Stokes is a little bit different, Salt, Livingston, Moeen Ali, these are all guys who are, and we haven't seen Livingston or Salt, but I'm going to assume all guys that are never going to be top level test match batters. Doesn't mean they can't bat in tests, and Buttler did well at times, and Moeen Ali can certainly score in test matches, and Livingston might still go on. But what you're talking about is a situation that if the ball is doing something, they don't really have that sort of cover the way that some of the other teams do have. I'm not sure that's a weakness because they should still win, far more matches than they lose. But if you compare that to perhaps a team like New Zealand or India or Pakistan, they're more on the hitting scale than they are on the batting scale. And so if conditions do call for slightly more batting, like in the Island game, sometimes you do look at their team and you're like, this is not particularly how they're set up. But when they bat to 11, that still... I thought that became a bigger problem for them when they started bringing some more specialist bowlers in at times. So when they're batting to 11, they still should have enough batting to be able to overcome you in 20 overs. When some of their batting lineups were finishing around 7 and 8 at times, I thought that's when that was a bigger issue. Sunit says, imagine seeing Livingston bowl better than a test great like Ashwin. But T20 cricket works in a different way. Also, the match situation was completely different and they had slightly different skill sets. And Livingston's a really interesting bowler because it's not even that he's non-traditional in the fact he bowls off spin and leg spin. He thinks about leg spin in a completely different way than a frontline spinner would. Adil Rashid has talked about this before. If he doesn't even try and help Liam Livingstone, because despite the fact they're both putting revs on the ball, they come at the game so differently. So he doesn't give him traditional help. So Livingston's a really interesting one. But there's going to be plenty of games, and we've seen them before, where Livingston can't get through 2 overs, right? And sometimes even 1 over. That's not going to be. That's the difference between him and someone like Ash, who should be able to do that. Neutral Guy says, do you agree with Rahul Dravid's statement about Indian players going overseas leagues will ruin the Ranji Trophy, which will ruin test matches? Do I agree with that? Well, he's probably saying that if Indian players start playing in overseas leagues, they'll play less Ranji Trophy cricket. And you might have more players who become specialist T20 players in that situation, which would mean that you would have a smaller pool of which to pick test players from. Do I agree with the entire statement? No, probably not. I mean, yes, to a certain point, because I suppose there will be players who would be very talented at both. I think of all the countries who could get by with that would be India. A lot of it comes down to priorities, right? What matters the most to the BCCI? What matters most to each individual group? There's a big fear from some people at the moment that, talking about what I just talked about with England a moment ago of, I suppose Nicholas Pooran is the most extreme example of this, although not through his own fault, of everyone knows how talented Nicholas Pooran is, but when he got worked out in T20 cricket, he didn't have the 2,000 or 3,000 first-class runs, and having to slug it out in Guyana on a glue pit pitch, and knew what it was like to play some county cricket, and knows what it's like to be hit on the fingers but still have to go on to bat on for another hour. All those little things, right? And I think there is a fear from some people, even. And I don't know if Rahul's one. I've never talked to him about this, so I have no idea. But I do think there's a fear through some of the other old school coaches that first class cricket is actually still a really good base for T20 talent. But what I would say is that we saw two guys who've played cricket in Adelaide play cricket in Adelaide tonight and do really well against India. I don't know if you can buy that kind of experience. Also, Alex Hales is a much better T20 player now because he has played all around the world. That has helped round his game off. I would say the same with Buttler. I saw both of them when they were very young. They were both incredible talents, but they are much more rounded now because of because they've had to travel around and play more cricket. And also in Hales's case, he's had to play for his supper a little bit more. And that's one thing that overseas leagues really make you do. They make you play as an old school professional, and there are things that India cricket could get out of that. But there's also a lot of negatives. You don't control the player; they don't always play in the role that you want. They can get injured in those other tournaments. They can their career spans can be brought down. All those sorts of things. So it's not. I don't think it's as clear cut as agreeing with Rahul's statement or not, and I also don't think it's as clear cut as he's made it either. There's so many variables once you open up that particular thing. I also think that perhaps at a younger age, it might be the age to let a lot of players out there and go. Deepak says, again, the team with the top 2 run scorers not even in the final. How many times does that happen in World Cup and IPL as well? Look, yeah, this is an efficiency game, especially T20 cricket. But even in one-day cricket sometimes, it's an efficiency game, and it is how many runs you score, but also the speed that you score them. And you talk to cricketers, especially more traditional cricketers, and they are still stuck in that old kind of mindset. The other thing I would say is, I've talked about this maybe yesterday. The teams with the best bowling attacks quite often win. So having the highest run scorers is really good. And, you never not want that to happen, but you want it to happen at speed, not just volume, but volume and speed. But realistically, having the best bowlers is probably a better option. Having the 2 highest wicket takers in a tournament, probably going to be more handy to you, I would have thought, over the long run than having the 2 highest run scorers. Thomas says, given the dimension of the ground, was Wood's injury a blessing in disguise for England? And if Wood is fit for the final, would you bring him back? Well, Jordan replaced him though, didn't he? I'm right in saying that. Jordan went for runs anyway. Jordan bowled really quick. He's at 91, 92 miles an hour at times today. So from that perspective, I don't think it had a big impact on it, unless I'm misremembering what happened. Yes, I think that it would have been interesting seeing Wood, because they could have scored. You can basically, on that pitch, you should be able to hit Wood for 6s on both sides of the wicket really easily. It does have those deep fine leg third pockets, as I was talking about before, so the ball can carry from that perspective. At the MCG, being able to bowl short and fast, though, if Wood's fully fit, I assume he would come back in. It's certainly, Liam Plunkett played there for the Melbourne Stars, before. It's that kind of wicket hitting the pitch. Marcus Stoinis, one of the reasons Marcus Stoinis bowls so many bounces is because he's played so much cricket at the MCG where you can get away with it. Paroxysmal says, the absolute arrogance of Kohli and Hardik asking the audience in the stadium to clap in the middle of England's innings. 1-6 by Buttler, and their mouths were shut. It's not arrogance. It's what you've got to use everything. You use the conditions. You use the crowd. You use the pitch. You use the outfield. That's what you do. I've got absolutely no problem with that. In fact, it's great. It didn't work, and it maybe came too late. I thought. I can't remember what over it was in, but I remember thinking, you probably would have wanted that from the start. It felt like, and I wasn't at the ground, but it did feel like a nervous Indian crowd from the start. they didn't quite seem to completely get in when it came to the crowd from that perspective. You know, there wasn't one of those Indian crowds that was that felt like it was going to sway the game, and perhaps it was just because, you know, India started slow, lost a wicket, and then didn't score massively quickly to begin with, and they were never really on top until the Hardik innings, and, you know, by the death, crowds are a little bit less relevant, I think, at that point. It's more that sort of early middle part. But no, I had no problem with that. Why has Alex Hales been so bad in the IPL? He has 146 runs in 6 games. I think you've answered your own question to a certain point there. He's got 146 runs in 6 games. 6 games is the key one. Played with the Sunrisers the first time, and go back and find my Twitter. I thought that it felt like they were trying to get him to play an anchor role, which I thought went against him. Also, those were the periods where that's kind of what the Sunrisers were doing. They were, you know, knocking the ball around a little bit more early on. I've talked about it a fair bit in that sort of era. But the 6 games is the most important thing. It's a bit like Luke Ronchi. Luke Ronchi went to the IPL really early on, failed, went off, became a really good T20 player, and never got another proper shot at it. It was quite clear that Luke Ronchi would have been a star had he come back. At the very least, you know, a very good a very good international level player. And I think Hales is much the same. He's not got the best reputation, it should be said. He's not the most well-liked person in cricket. And if you think those things don't matter, they definitely do matter. He hasn't been an England player as well. So a lot of his record, you know, for a while now. So a lot of his record is probably seen to be in the lower level, you know, domestic leagues. You know, he hasn't had a chance to play against India in a game and make 80 or 50 or whatever it was today, which those things happened when it comes to IPL auctions. But yeah, I think because he played so poorly the first time and he wasn't particularly a force, I think that probably, and we've seen lots of players do that. It could just be 6 bad games. And I think there's a lot of too soon deciding that players are not particularly good based on a handful of games. And so from that perspective, I would say that has all played a part in him not doing well. But the only other thing I would say is I think he's got a good record in Pakistan. I'm pretty sure he does. Those are slightly different pitches. I wonder if early on in his career he would have been that good playing in places like Pakistan and India anyway, just because he really has developed a lot over the last 4 years, I'd say, 3.5 years maybe. And part of that is because he has had to play in a few different places because he hasn't been playing for England, so he's had to go and work on his game. GA says, big fan of your channel, and you make some really strong points, but today you can't say Rahul's a good player. Yeah, Rahul's a good player. He's bad under pressure. He got a leg cutter from back of a length that probably did more off that wicket than we saw any other ball today. That's like saying that Rohit's not a good player because we saw him play today. Rohit might be finished. He might be on a downward curve. He might have been in world's worst form. Come on, guys. We're better than this, GA. We're better than this. He's obviously a good player because he has made a lot of runs in T20 cricket over a long period of time. It would be physically unable for him to not be a good player and do that. You can't make runs consistently. And he's done it against good bowlers before. He's done it internationally. He's done it in multi-formats, right? We've got to stop with this nonsense. It really is. I think it's part of the reason that I think that, and I've said this before, I don't, other than the money and the fame and the power, I'm not sure why you'd want to be an Indian cricketer. It must be just horrendous at the moment to fail a couple of times. The amount of nonsense I saw when Rishabh Pant had a bad season in the IPL. You have bad seasons, right? These things happen. And we see again and again. I think, yeah. I mean, put it this way: if I was working for an IPL franchise or an international team, and I could recruit a player, KL Rahul is going to be really high up on my list. I've got absolutely no fear that he's a really good player. What I would say is my biggest problem with KL Rahul is not that he's failed in a couple of high pressure matches. My biggest problem with KL Rahul is he's not even playing the way that he used to play. The way that I wish he would play when he was absolutely fantastic. And that KL Rahul would have been really handy today. Plotting KL Rahul, think there are other players who can do that role, but that's a completely separate one. I am going to finish up there because I've now got to go do a live on Spotify Live. So if you want to come across there in about 5 to 10 minutes, I will be there once I've had a toilet break and Muku's had a break as well. But we'll be over there finishing up. Great chat again today. Thanks for the questions. Really good ones as from everyone again. I'm not quite sure what the schedule is between now and the final. I've got a piece that I want to do. I will give Charlie probably a topic as well. And if that's the case, hopefully we can each do one more show for you, meaning that we'll have a show tomorrow and then we'll have a show on Saturday. Would that be? Yeah, Saturday. And then obviously we'll be back straight after the final. But all things considered, really hoping that we'll be around for every single day because it's a World Cup mood board. And what is the World Cup without its mood board? Probably more or less the same, but you would have to find something else to watch. I'll see you tomorrow.